Hello and welcome to Path to Power America. I'm Matt Cooper and I'm delighted to be joined for this new endeavour by Marion McKeone, who is a long-standing friend and colleague going back at this stage, I think, Marion, nearly 30 years.
We're giving it all away, Matt. 30 years. Jeepers. Yes, it would be about that.
Indeed. Marion worked with me in the Sunday Tribune when I was the editor there. She was working with the Business Post when I persuaded her to become our American correspondent. And then in my time as presenter of The Last Word on Today FM, she has been a regular contributor over the years on American issues, usually in collaboration with Cal Thomas. And we're cheating on Cal as well because we're leaving him out.
And we're cheating on Ivan. Do you think Cal and Ivan are going to run away together?
Maybe we could set them up as a couple. They'd actually be quite alike in many respects.
They get on very well.
They would. Okay, so what we're going to try and do in Path to Power America is that some of you might be thinking, well, what do these people know sitting in Dublin about what's going on in America? But what I want to do in this podcast is have discussions about what's happening in the use of power in politics, business and the media in the United States. All the things probably a bit wider than what Ivan and myself do in Path to Power in Ireland. Looking at it from the point of view that these things have impact on our lives here in Ireland, that what happens in America matters very, very much to us. And Marion has an extraordinary amount of experience from her time living in the United States on and off for nearly 30 years.
Well, a bit less than that, I'd say. But I went over there first in 99 and then I was working for you, of course, in the Tribune, stayed until the Obama inauguration. I left shortly after that. And then I went back and Ian Keogh, the former editor of the Business Post, said to me in about 2016, listen, this election, it's Donald Trump and it's Hillary Clinton. And sure, obviously Hillary Clinton's going to win, but it'll be a bit of a laugh. Will you do it? And I think we all thought that. And then, of course, we saw what happened. And then since then, America has been through so many. There's just never been a good time to leave. And then finally, a couple of weeks ago, I did move back to Ireland. But so much has happened, my God, in the intervening nine-ish years. So, yeah, about two chunks of time. Really, the first one spanned 9/11, Iraq, or whatever. And there's almost a feeling now, as we're talking today, that are we going back into another? We're certainly in uncharted waters in so many ways.
Yeah, we're talking today. This is Wednesday, June 25th. And I'm sort of conscious of the fact that as we talk, things might be changing. Everything happens at such speed in Trump's America these days. Yep. I think almost deliberately so. The chaos theory is something that he certainly seems to lean very much into. But there is something that I do want to talk to you about in a bit of detail. Because in your time in America, and you're writing in the Business Post in particular on what you've done on The Last Word, it's been very clear that you don't just talk to the people in power, having all the quotes from the people on the record, or the off-the-record background briefings from people in positions of influence. You've also spent a lot of time traveling around America. You know America very well. You've been living on the West Coast, having previously lived on the East Coast, but you've spent a lot of time in Middle America and you spent a lot of time talking to MAGA people. You've gone to some of their incredible rallies. And that's what I want to talk about today to an extent, the anti-war agenda amongst the MAGA movement, which Trump, I think, risked with his bombing of Iran and the potential of falling into a war. Because if we go back, I've got a quote from Trump's inauguration speech in which he said, "We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars that we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into." He also declared that his proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier. That was a major part of his appeal, wasn't it, to the MAGA base, which he risked by deciding to have the bunker buster bombs in Iran.
Yeah, now I think that is partly true, but I also have a slightly different theory, just based on, as I said, thousands of conversations with people. There are two iterations of MAGA. There was the 2016 to 2020 MAGA, which in my view was a very, very different MAGA to the one that there is today, the 2024 MAGA. So when I started off, I'll illustrate this with a conversation I had. And there are certain conversations when you're travelling around that you always remember. And I was talking to a guy from Nebraska, a really decent man from Nebraska. And he had worked as a miner. He was working in the mines in Nebraska in his 20s and 30s and 40s. And he was making about 120 grand a year, thereabouts, brutal work, long hours. And he had 5 children, but he was getting the benefits, etc. And he was laid off. The mine was shut. And I remember him saying to me, and then 2008 happened, the crash, and he lost his house. And he ended up around when I spoke to him, which was early 2015, I think. And he said to me, I'm working in Home Depot now. I'm stocking shelves. I'm getting $10 an hour, but I still have 5 children. And for him, the bewildering thing, he had lost his home. He had lost his well-paying job. He was now working for $10 an hour in a Home Depot in Nebraska. But he had still the same responsibilities, the same liabilities, and nobody cared. Nobody cared. Hillary Clinton was talking about retraining people to work in tech jobs and green jobs. And he was saying, I left school when I was 15. I'm not going to be able to retrain for one of these jobs. So they were the people who Trump first spoke to. And I saw that at those early rallies, like in places like, even Las Vegas, where you had a lot of unskilled workers, a lot of people who were there in the hospitality industry, a lot of people who'd lost their homes in 2009, 2010, 2011. And they saw Obama, as they saw it, bailing out the banks, but nobody was giving them a new home. And a lot of them were in their 40s and 50s, and they thought, I'm never going to get another home. I've lost my job. I've lost my home. I'm now working minimum wage job. I'm renting some dump, and this is where my life is. And Trump got in there, and even if he wasn't going to do anything, he gave a voice to this rage that they felt and this frustration.
It's funny you should say that, because obviously your experience of these things is way more than mine. Like, I'm one of these people who's an occasional visitor to the United States and tend to go to the big cities. When you're a tourist, you go to New York or you go to Chicago or you go to Boston, where the places I've been over the last decade, or maybe down to Orlando, where I brought the family down to Universal and Disney World when they were smaller. But there was one time that I did travel outside of those sort of normal areas. I was making a documentary with my friend Carolyn O'Hara for TV3, as it was then, Virgin Media, back in 2017. I think we might have interviewed you at the time, actually, Trump versus America. And we spent a bit of time driving out. We went into Lehigh Valley to Bethlehem, which was the home of American Steel.
That's right.
And we did an interview or two down there, and it was in the old steel plant, which had been effectively turned into a museum of a sense. Yeah. And actually, I was very taken by then, not long afterwards, Trump, I think, went there for one of his rallies or a TV interview and whatever. But what I couldn't get over when we went to these places outside of the cities was what looked like poverty, effectively, in rural America. And also people clearly sort of living on, you go to the sort of the diners and you have cheap food, which clearly is really, really bad for people. And you got to say, I remember at the time, actually, we were discussing, we'd all read on the trip, those of us in the production team, we'd all read, of all things, J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, and we could sort of see why all this stuff was actually coming up. So I fully get the point that you make about the poverty thing. But why do you think MAGA has changed so from 2016 to 2024? Because I thought the likes of the Steve Bannons are still around, if not always in Trump's ear like they were 8-9 years ago, still highly influential in sort of keeping that pressure on Trump to deliver for them in this absolutely nationalistic, ourselves first movement.
Yeah. And, Steve Bannon is still very much around, and he's in his little townhouse up in Washington. And I believe he had lunch with Trump before Trump made the decision to go in and support Israel. And he made his views clear to Trump. And clearly,
Sorry, what would Bannon's views have been? Don't do this. Do not support this.
Do not do this. Do not fracture the movement. This is crazy. We said no wars, etc., etc. Let them get on with it themselves. And, there is a view that Israel was doing just fine. Israel has, if you look at Israel's strategy from since 7th of October 2023, it was to systematically dismantle all of the Iranian proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, the group that they're supporting in Iraq as well. And then when they had completely isolated Iran, then to go after Iran. That's pretty well what they've done. And Bannon was saying, we've been in now the Middle East, and correctly to a degree, for decades, it's never worked. You were the one who said no more wars. You're the one who said no more American military's sons and daughters being brought home in coffins. And what the hell are you doing here? So obviously, Bannon's an interesting guy because nobody trusts him. He's an inveterate leaker. He leaks every time Michael Wolff opens his mouth. Steve Bannon, he's basically Bannon's ventriloquist. It's incredible.
But it's very entertaining.
But it's very entertaining. We wouldn't deny that. But and then you had the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Charlie Kirks, another fascinating guy. These are all such different characters who are now occupied the sort of
the right-wing headbangers.
Yeah. But you can certainly, I wouldn't disagree with you there, but Charlie Kirk is another one that we must chat about at some point because his path to power has been pretty damn astonishing as well. And he's a very, very odd individual. I've spoken to him. But they were all about this isolationism and that, we don't give a damn what's going on in the world. We want to get richer here and we just want to get immigrants out.
Yeah, okay.
And that's their big thing.
Before we get to the immigrants out type thing, though, I am interested in the war thing because I've just been the last few nights at home. I've been watching a Netflix documentary series on Vietnam. My youngest son is going into his Leaving Cert next year. He's doing history. American presidents is one of the things that they cover in the history curriculum. So I said, you're watching Vietnam documentaries with me. And so we've been watching the Turning Point series. I don't know if you've ever seen that one. And there's various other Netflix Vietnam documentaries on Apple at the moment. But I chose this one as a 5-parter. And it's a real eye-opener. And it's shocking to sort of remember what the Vietnamese quite correctly say is the American War, rather than the Americans saying the Vietnam War. And it's shocking what was done to Vietnam. It's shocking the way that ordinary Americans were used as cannon fodder. In much the way that Putin is using ordinary Russians now in Ukraine.
A lot of parallels.
And just watching the second episode of it last night, I mean, the lies that were told by the White House and by the Pentagon to justify the mass slaughter of Americans who they just literally threw into the machine and just sacrificed their lives at a time when there were many draft dodgers, Trump being the most obvious example of that. I can fully understand why you would actually have a significant portion of the American people saying, why? Why do we send the people to these wars, these unwinnable wars? And when you go beyond also what happened in Vietnam, if you even go to 2003 in the Iraq War, because the first thing that came to me when I was listening to Trump's justifications for the bombing of Iran, and the claim that he had obliterated the nuclear, which looks like immediately,
unsurprisingly.
Unsurprisingly, anything that Trump says, you cannot believe, you cannot take it at face value. But remember, and mainly because of weapons of mass destruction in 2003. Remember how we were sold that pop?
Oh, look, I was down at the UN for that whole thing, and I remember Colin Powell coming in with his little vial of whatever it was in there, something powdery anyway, and going,
what?
This much. He literally came in.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I thought you were suggesting that he was coming in for something that he might take.
Well, for all we know.
No, we would never say that about Colin Powell.
But he came in and he had been briefed, and it was this little ridiculous thing of, do you remember Netanyahu with his cartoon bomb? So Netanyahu was coming into the UN in 2003, 2008, 2012, and talk about the Prime Minister that cried wolf. And every time he had this little cartoon bomb with the little explosion, like the ones you'd see in any cartoon that you remember from the 70s, and he'd have a red line drawn across. You go, they're that close. 2016, 2022.
Netanyahu's been saying this since the mid-1990s. He's been spreading the same bullshit all the time.
Powell did that in 2003, and he was going, this much anthrax will kill, 1 million people. There was no evidence ever to say that Saddam Hussein had anthrax, and Scott Ritter and all these people came out and said, we've been in there. Anything they had, you could use as hair gel at this stage. It's completely degraded. But anyway, Powell was in there, and I got to know Powell's Chief of Staff, Larry Wilkerson, a really honourable, decent member of the military. And Larry said to me afterwards, we were lied to. We were lied to. We were misled. And then Powell, who was a very honourable man, went out there and sold this. Now, I suspect that he had misgivings anyway, clearly, but the American people were lied to. And the reason, and I think this gets us to where we're going in a very roundabout way, the reason
it's
that Trump's...
we can do things in a roundabout way, yes.
that this is resonating so much with the American people is the veterans from that war are now living homeless on so many of the American streets. The veterans from that war, their families are looking at them. They're unable to work. They're addicted to drugs. They're getting no help. The consequences of the war in Iraq are being lived at in millions of American families every day. People who came home, people who were injured, people who lost a leg, who lost an arm, who were so traumatized by that war. Because let's not forget that the last troops only came out of Afghanistan in, 2021, the summer of 2021. So all of these soldiers have now returned home. There were hundreds of thousands of them. Very few of them have thrived since then. Very few of them have gone on and gone back in and got jobs. There are very few Pete Hegseths, and it's debatable that he's actually not that he's thrived in any way at all. But that so many of these families, they come home, they live in these awful conditions. I've been to military bases. My God, the conditions these kids live in and their families, they're just god awful. They're infested with rats. They're just appalling. So they make these sacrifices, and then, people will say, thank you for your service, and then move on. And so the belief, the patriotism that spurred people to join the military after they realised they'd been lied to by George W. Bush. And no two ways about it. They were lied to. They were deceived. And the big sign up, and I remember being in New York after 9/11, and they'd put up all these kind of trailers, like porta cabins all around Times Square. There were lines of kids wanting to join the military army, the US military, down the street, all around Times Square. People wanted to sign up to fight for America. And then they took all that goodwill, they took all that patriotism and love for their country, because Americans really love their country in a fierce way. And they then used it and deceived them and sold them a package of lies, and they sent them into another country, into Iraq, to settle an old score, because George W. Bush wanted to be as big as Daddy. And that was really basically
And Daddy, of course, had liberated Kuwait back in 1991, didn't push forward and take out Saddam Hussein in Baghdad.
Yeah.
Okay, but see, a few things as well in this. Trump saying he would never go to war, and he was, I think, quite clear, and maybe he was being clever in relation to this, that he thought one-offs, surgical strike, as they use, the bullshit type of terms that they use, of sending in the bombs to obliterate Iran's nuclear capacity. We now realise that they seem to have moved all of the uranium, that whatever damage might have been done to the underground facilities might be to the entrances, whatever. It's only a temporary particular measure. But I suppose the reason that Trump got so upset that Israel and Iran looked like they mightn't stick to the ceasefire is that he doesn't want to be dragged into a war. I mean, it was a one-off thing he wanted to do, wasn't it? Rather than getting involved in having to send troops on the ground.
He also called it his 12-day war. Now is it going to be his 13-day war? It's very confusing. Like when you've done all your marketing, and you've done all your, and it's like now what? It's a 12-and-a-half-day war. It's a it's a 55-day war. Like it's a bit like mission accomplished.
Yeah, but the news cycle moves so quickly, and I mean he just manipulates the news cycle so much that he probably will get away with a lot of this, won't he?
Trump gets away with an extraordinary amount. Look, Steve Bannon again, not to get back to him too much, but he came up with the master plan, which we know it's very simple. It was flood the zone with shit. So the point being, and he correctly and cynically said it, the American public and the American media cannot cope with a fire hose of news every day. They just can't. So you just fire hose it all out. You spray it all, and they're scrambling here and they're scrambling there. And that is how Trump's been operating. We saw with all the Doge chaos. We saw, there's so much stuff that's going on, and he creates a crisis. Now, let's not forget where this came from. We won't go back to 1953 to Operation Ajax, but just to mention
what was Operation Ajax?
Okay, so Operation Ajax in Iran was when the Iranians had democratically elected a new prime minister, and the Americans and the British said, oh, no, because this chap wants to nationalise the oil reserves. And the British at the time thought that they really had first dibs and owned all the oil in Iran. So the CIA went in, and the UK with the Americans, and they got this guy out and they installed the Shah. And now, no, so the Shah then was basically giving everything to Britain and America that they wanted, but the Iranians were getting none of this wealth. So there was a revolution in 1979, and then in came the extremists, in came the Ayatollahs. And then from there on, you had the hostage crisis, you had Hezbollah blowing up.
But you also have a horrible repressive regime in
and
Iran,
let's not cry any tears for these mullahs and for these people, because they replaced, as always, they replaced the Shah with an even worse situation. But then you had Reagan going in there, like American foreign policy. You don't forget Iran-Contra. Like, basically, America agreed to support Iraq in invading Iran in 1980. Okay? So America is now on the side of Iraq and of Saddam Hussein. They go in there, kick those fellows around, we'll support you. So this 8-year war goes on. Millions of people are killed in it. It's absolutely horrific. But in the middle of that, around 1985 or whatever, you've got Reagan's looking at South America and Nicaragua and the Contras down there and all this. And they want to get
Central America.
Central America, I beg your pardon. They want to get 8 hostages out of Lebanon. So they say, why don't we sell arms to Iran, even though we're supporting Iraq in this war? And why don't we then use the money we get from those arms and give them to the Contras? This is American foreign policy. So that was what happened. Disaster.
So only to American foreign policy. I think also one of the reasons why Trump was determined to say this is just a sort of a one-off attack on Iran rather than a declaration of war, although all of his Truth Social posts would make you believe it was essentially a war, was because he hadn't gone to Congress to actually get approval.
Yes.
This is very interesting because I was listening to something else which suggested that Congress doesn't actually want to be put in the position of having to approve. They want the executive orders made by the president.
Absolutely.
And it goes back to Vietnam because Congress voted for Vietnam and that has contributed to the distrust of Congress amongst voters. And that a lot of people have criticised Barack Obama for failing to move on Syria about a decade ago.
Yeah.
And again, though, that went to Congress and Congress told Barack Obama not to attack. So he had drawn his red lines. Yeah. And that failure to actually go and deal with the Syria, to be the world's policeman, seems to have encouraged Russia in particular in relation to what it did in Ukraine.
It's always the law of unintended consequences, isn't it? Because people really criticised Obama because he said chemical weapons, red line, and then Assad. And, I worked for a while in a non-journalistic capacity during that war, like the Syrian on the Lebanese border.
You better explain what you were up to.
This makes me sound like I was up to something very sinister.
It makes you sound like you're a deep plant, as if you were some sort of Marion McKeone in her diversion in her career to being a spy. No, you weren't.
A little detour. No, I worked for an NGO, a big American NGO, in their human rights advocacy and also wrangling journalists, because a lot of foreign journalists who would go into these places were not being properly trained or briefed by their newspapers. And not only were they in danger of getting themselves killed, they were in danger of getting a lot of other people killed as well. And it was kind of alarming to me the way in which some people were operating. But anyway, so I was there and I was working on the border between Lebanon and Syria for a lot of that. And the savagery of that war, the savagery of what Assad did to his own people was absolutely appalling. And, Obama said, OK, if he uses chemical weapons, that's the red line. But then, of course, as you say correctly, Congress then went, no, we're not getting involved in this. So this time, there are a couple of things about this. Firstly, Trump said, Republicans, the contempt they hold the UN in cannot be overstated. They despise it. And it's not just Trump. It was Bush before that. It was Reagan before that. So in theory, there should have been, Israel should have gone to the UN. Like before a war starts, you're supposed to go to the UN, you get your resolutions. We all saw what happened in 2003 when Bush went in, got one resolution, and then he went to get another one, didn't like the look of it, went, feck it, and just went in anyway.
Well, Tony Blair's support, Britain's support.
Yeah,
anyway,
exactly. Yeah. But this time round, people said, Obama used his little drones to go into Pakistan and Libya and places like that. He didn't get permission. So why should Trump have to get permission to go in and strike in Iran? And you know what? That's a reasonable
There's a certain
point.
Logic to it. Okay, we need to take a break. But what I want to talk about when we come back after the break is the influence of the Israeli lobby in the United States. Also, because this isn't all going to be about politics, this podcast, I want to talk about Jeff Bezos and his wedding in Venice.
No love for Jeff in Venice.
And I also want to talk about the Kennedys on the back of the controversy over Ryan Murphy's decision to make a TV drama out of the death of John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren, I think
That's
was her
right.
name,
Yep.
the Bissettes. And well, again, typical America, the controversy is not just that the story's been made, but about the clothes that the actors were wearing.
It's the hair.
And the photographs were bad in the recreation. How can we trust this if they can't get the hair and the clothes right? We'll come back and discuss all of those things after this quick break. Welcome back to Path to Power America. Marion McKeone is here with me. And just for one last thing on the politics, and there's two things, I suppose, in relation to Israel. Has Benjamin Netanyahu played Trump? As in, has he actually, up until the time when Trump got really mad and dropped the F-bomb and then took to Truth Social to say, I've told Israel they have to pull back and not bomb anymore. But has Netanyahu played Trump? And just how deep does the influence of the Israeli lobby actually work in Washington and beyond?
Wow, I think that Netanyahu has played Trump like a set of drums. I mean, he is such a wily operator. Let's not forget, he's been around in politics for 3 decades now. He was first elected Prime Minister in 1996. And the way he has manipulated not just Trump, but also the way he manipulated Biden before him. But I think with Trump, he knew exactly what he was doing. There was a very interesting report in the Washington Post by 3 excellent journalists that said Netanyahu had planned this strike last October. And he knew he had to do it by the end of June. And one of the reasons he knew he had to do it by the end of June was that the CENTCOM commander at the moment for the US, a guy called Eric Kurilla, is very, very close to the Israeli IDF leaders. And America was concerned about that. The Pentagon was privately concerned about that he was a little bit too close, but they knew that they wanted to get this done while he was still in situ. But look, if you look at the sequence of events, it's almost comical. Trump is throwing himself a parade. So it's his birthday and it's the 250th anniversary of the US Army, incidental. And Trump decides, I'm going to have a parade because he's wanted this parade since 2017.
Bit of a damn squib though, wasn't it?
It was a disaster. It wasn't just a damn squid. Nobody turned up. All the bleachers were empty. You had American soldiers going by and instead of looking fierce, they're going, hey, hello. They're waving little drones in the air and they're giving the thumbs up.
Like a pride parade.
It's honestly, it looked like a pride parade. And then all the military, instead of being in formation, they've all been sleeping on the floor in the Department of Agriculture the night before, and they're all crumpled and they're kind of like, they're sort of slouching along, like looking like people who had no sleep, who were on their way home from a rave or something, So Trump is sitting there and he's glowering. And Pete Hegseth is beside me. You can see Hegseth going, oh shit, I'm going to get fired. You can just see it. Or maybe he was hungover. Who knows? Or both. And but anyway, so the whole thing is a humiliation for Trump. And meanwhile, you have the No Kings marches all over America and there are 5 million people out.
Do we know 5 million? Because I was getting this from listeners to the last word who were going on. This is typical leftist, communist claptrap that you're actually promoting, this idea that 5 million turned up. I mean, is that as real as Trump's estimates for people who turned up at his inauguration?
Well, I went through the numbers because I'm a bit of a sad nerd about things like this, okay? So I went through the numbers and places like Boise, Idaho,
where?
Boise, yeah, exactly. And weirdly, I've been there and it's not a big town, but it was packed. People were coming out of sheltered housing, old people in wheelchairs to join this. It was astonishing. People, the villages, I don't know if you've ever been to the villages, Matt, in Florida. Be careful you don't end up there. It's a retirement home. It's the world's biggest retirement village. It's about 100,000 people.
That's where Cal lives.
No, he's further down. He's further down the road. He's in Boca. Where's he? I've been to Cal's place in Florida. It's very nice, let me tell you. But anyway, the villages all came out, and this is core Republican. They came out and protested. And in Salt Lake City, again, another place I've been, which is diehard conservative, they had a massive crowd. So it wasn't just the New Yorks, the LA, etc. It was, so they reckon, objective crowd analysts reckon that it was 5 million.
Well, we'll talk about the immigration issue and other, but I want to just stick to the Israel thing at the moment, because my view, just from
but
watching
I'm
it on.
to it. This is my roundabout. I'm doing the weave.
Yeah,
I'm doing the weave, as Trump would say.
God, right, but we'll do a lot of weaves in this. Okay. But my impression was the timing of what happened in Iran happened just as the international pressure finally, belatedly, for the horrors of what Israel is doing in Gaza was getting really, and then this is the big distraction suddenly. And even over during the duration of this 12 or 13 day war or whatever, the Israelis have been continuing to murder loads of people in Gaza, murdering them at food
while
points.
They're waiting for food.
And can I also say that, in case anyone tries to say that what we're saying here is anti-Semitic, it's anti-Israeli government if we point out the horrors of what's done. I mean, we're not anti-Muslim because we've already said in this podcast that the Iranian regime is repressive and evil. That doesn't make us anti-Muslim, just like it doesn't make us anti-Israeli to actually say the Israel government at present is being absolutely despicable. That does not make us anti-Semitic.
Absolutely.
However, that brings me to my question in the sense is that, and I think this is something that's very clear with an awful lot of European leaders, but is it the same in America, that there is a real fear of criticizing Israel in case it's perceived to be anti-Semitic?
Well, this is what Netanyahu has used with enormous skill for years and years and years, where he has always conflated criticism of the Israeli government and him in particular with anti-Semitism, whereas in fact he has arguably done more damage to the state of Israel and to its reputation around the world, and has probably been the cause of, and there is a lot of anti-Semitism, and people shouldn't deny that. There's a lot of it in America, there's a lot of it everywhere, there's a lot of it in Ireland, but that is not the same thing. You can legitimately criticise the atrocities that he is presiding over in Gaza, and that does not make you an anti-Semite. But the way that they have in America, there's such a fear, and we saw in Harvard, we saw in Columbia, the directors, the presidents were driven out, and we see what's happening now with Harvard with these trumped-up charges of anti-Semitism, where Trump is using that as a stick. Now, let me give you a fascinating, and again, a little bit of a weave here. 2017, the Zionist Organization of America gave Steve Bannon, an absolute, the white supremacist poster boy, a special award. And I went to that event, and Joe Lieberman was there. And Joe Lieberman, of course, was Al Gore's running mate.
Yeah.
And I said, why? What are you doing? Why are you giving Steve Bannon, who even his own wife has said is a virulent anti-Semite? I said, why? Well, his ex-wife. Why are you
yes,
giving
I
him?
Think it would be ex-wife to say something like that.
Why are you giving him an award? Why are you acknowledging him? And he said, this isn't an appropriate question. And I said, well, why isn't it an appropriate question? And he walked off. So there's a weird, my enemy's enemy's enemy is my friend in America. And because Steve Bannon was supporting, there are a couple of...
But sorry, isn't there a history, though, of anti-Semitism in America?
Yes.
And Jews were discriminated against in the
Absolutely.
same way Catholics were discriminated against.
Horrific. And there is still anti-Semitism in America. But ironically, a lot of the people who were really leading in that were a lot of conservative Republicans. There are a couple of different strains. You have white supremacists, okay? A lot of the Trump MAGA base. And we saw the chants in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. We saw all that. We saw Trump refuse to condemn it in any meaningful way. We saw all that. You then have the Ted Cruzes who say they use the Bible as a shield and a sword. The Bible says that those who bless Israel will be blessed. And then you have the Mike Huckabees, who's current governor. And what they believe is, which is so weird and so nuts.
He's the ambassador,
He's the ambassador
to Israel
moment,
now, yeah.
Is that
Carl introduced me to him once. There you go.
Yeah. Anyway, Huckabee believes, like a lot of Christian evangelicals believe, that there is going to be an end of days.
Rapture.
And it's going to be fought in Israel. And at that, all of the Jews are going to be killed. Everybody who isn't a Christian is going to be killed. But Israel has to be in place for this to happen. So that's a crude thumbnail explanation of it. So as I said,
we're not going down a conspiracy rabbit hole here. I'm sorry,
but that is the evangelical belief.
And isn't there also the Samson theory that basically that apparently they have about 90 nukes, And the Israeli position is that if they get it, they'll take everyone out. If they're going to go, they'll just use all their nukes to blow up the rest of the world. If they're going, if we're going, you're going too.
They're taking us with them.
That is a conspiracy theory, isn't it?
Well, they do have a nuclear program. Nobody ever talks about it. Nobody ever discusses it. But we know that Israel has nuclear weapons. Okay, now nobody wants Iran to get nuclear weapons, and I think that it should be
good reason.
For very good reason. So I think,
but I don't think we want Israel to have nuclear weapons either. But they haven't, and they won't allow themselves to be inspected.
They're not inspected.
Or regulated.
They're not. They won't. So the IAEA has no. It's kind of fascinating.
But then why does America continue? I mean, is it because that there is this? Okay, there is a lot of Jewish influence now in America, and is it a sort of a guilt that in the past there was anti-Semitism, and like the collective guilt that there is in Europe about not having prevented the Holocaust, that then jumps over too far in supporting Israel, even when it does things that are clearly wrong, such as the genocide in Gaza.
Absolutely. And, from 1948, successive US presidents have had that. And it's like, my God, we let this happen. We allowed 6 million people to perish in the Holocaust. We turned away the boats with Jews coming. A lot of terrible things happened. And so it's interesting because Clinton was the first president to meet Netanyahu in his prime minister capacity. And he had a meeting with him. And Clinton came out of the meeting. And I did hear this. And he came out and he said, who the fuck does that guy think he is? Like, he thinks that they're the superpower here, not us, because Netanyahu was basically telling Clinton what to do. And then, fast forward to Obama, and Netanyahu did not get on at all. He went to Washington. He deliberately humiliated Obama by not addressing Congress without even doffing his cap at the White House in any way, just totally bypassed him. And then Obama, of course, negotiated. It took 2 years to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal. This was a deal that was working. It came into effect, and all of the IAEA people were allowed in. They said, they're abiding by it. And this deal meant that basically, without being wonky, Iran could enrich its uranium up to 3.67%. It's now at way over 60%. There is good cause for alarm. There's genuine cause for alarm what's happening in Iran with its nuclear program. But at the time, they abided by the deals. It meant sanctions would be lifted and that their economy could get up off its knees. Trump comes in 2018 and Netanyahu's saying to him, get rid of that deal, because Netanyahu always wanted to go after Iran. And Trump, of course, tears up the deal, partly because it's got Obama's signature on it and he can't bear Obama to have done anything that worked. And so then he gives Netanyahu everything he wants while he's president. Biden comes in. Biden is led around by the nose around Gaza. And Biden, it's a terrible stain on his legacy, the way that he allowed himself to be manipulated and the way that he allowed those atrocities to happen in Gaza under the name of, persecuting a legitimate war. Look, Hamas went in, they slaughtered Israelis. Israel had a right to defend itself. But what has happened since then, we've all seen. So now Trump's back in town. But Trump is different because Trump everybody said to Biden, don't give him the weapons. Stop giving weapons while there's famine, while he's doing all this stuff. Trump is more likely, in a weird way, to say to Netanyahu, if you don't hold a ceasefire, no more weapons for you. Because Trump wants a win. He wants a quick win. And that's the secret to Trump. He doesn't want to do the hard work. He wants the credit.
Okay, this is going to be a difficult pivot to get away from really important things like this, but I think we'll do it anyway. We're not going to talk about Trump at The Hague for the NATO conference because, again, by the time people get a chance to hear this, who knows what will have come out of that. But the rumour is that Trump is then going to fly on to Venice, that he's actually going to go to Jeff Bezos' wedding. And I think this is going to be a major flashpoint. I'm fascinated by the reaction in Italy. And remember, Meloni is very well disposed towards Putin. But the people of Italy, I think, are really seeing this as that the super rich cannot buy us off. The super rich cannot shut down Venice for 3 days just for the benefit of Jeff Bezos and 200 mates who are going to be there for his wedding just because Amazon is rich enough. And Amazon has been fined by the Italian authorities previously for work practices there. Right. There is complete concern about the way that it does things, how it runs its business. And I think this is fascinating because I've just read a book called The Haves and the Have-Yachts.
It's wonderful.
By Dispatches on the Ultra-Rich by Evan Osnos, which basically is a collection of his writings from the New Yorker magazine with little addendums bringing them up to date from the time. And probably the standout chapter is about these incredible super yachts that not just Americans, but rich people all over the world, particularly Russians, have. But Bezos is one of these tech bros who has one of these incredibly
a gigi yacht, I think it's called.
Gigi, that's right.
Gigi yacht, yeah.
And of course, rather than having the wedding on the yacht, he has decided that he wants to go into Venice and take control of this, and the world's media will all pay attention. But I think this has the potential to be a flashpoint, and that people will just say, this is nonsense. And particularly after the recent stunt with his Origin, isn't it?
The 11-minute flight into space.
Yeah, with Katy
Perry. The ladies
Perry.
who launch, yeah.
And his wife to be, what's her name?
Lauren Sanchez.
Lauren Sanchez, yes. And they have a colourful history as well, don't they?
Certainly do.
Okay. Do you think, though, could it be, or do we look too often maybe to think of things might be a turning point and that people would just say, we've had enough of this, but actually the wealth is so entrenched at this stage and this sort of, we don't actually do anything about it.
You know what's fascinating about this is it's been announced now that Bezos cannot have his big third day party in Venice, that they're going to move it from the beautiful place that was supposed to be the 16th century hall or whatever it was to a place called the Arsenale, which is kind of a bit of a military place behind a high wall. So it's worked. The protest has worked. And what they said they were going to do was they were going to completely flood the canals. And I think this is kind of brilliant, actually, with inflatable crocodiles so that the gondolas and the boats and the water taxis wouldn't be able to get through. So they were going to put thousands of inflatable crocodiles in all the waters. And Bezos, obviously, at that point went, you know what? Feck it. And so he has now moved the third day. The wedding vows are being taken on the private island, so they can't get to him there. But so it worked.
But also this book, the Osnos book, actually also has stories about these incredibly stupid parties that people, not just for themselves, but for their kids, like bar mitzvahs and various other things.
Oh my God.
And spending small fortunes on bringing rappers and other singers and stuff.
This is a huge thing.
In America, isn't it?
A friend of mine who's a photographer has done bar mitzvahs where they'll have Snoop Dogg. They'll pay these rappers. They'll pay, and it's always the kids at the bar mitzvahs. They always want rappers. They don't, and it's kind of ironic because some of the pictures I saw, like you'd all these little 13-year-old boys, and they're there and they've got their very expensive baggy trousers down around their ankles, almost like trying to pretend they're P. Diddy or whoever the hell they're trying to pretend to be.
Well, and it's hopefully not P.
Diddy, but Snoop or whoever. And I think these rappers think it's hilarious because you don't even have to be a top-notch rapper.
Yeah, you get paid a fortune.
You get $1 million to go along and perform at a bar mitzvah. Why the hell wouldn't you? So it's a really big source of income. But as I say, in LA, it's all the rappers that they want.
I wonder who'll end up performing at Bezos' wedding.
Well,
Lauren Sanchez.
I think it might be Katy Perry, not giving anything away there because they're very good buddies.
They went,
and
this
J-Lo
is the trade-off for the space trip. Yeah.
There's no such thing as a free space trip. Let me just tell you that, Matt, in case you're ever offered one. But you might have to sing as well.
Okay, well, actually, then the other thing I want to talk a little bit about in the time we have left is the Ryan Murphy TV show about the death of John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren. And I suppose before we get into the story itself, just explain a little bit more about the reference we made just before the break to the photo shoot for the publicity and the controversy about the clothes and the hair.
Oh my God, that is hilarious. Okay, so Ryan Murphy did a little, photo shoot release, and the actress who's playing Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was a style icon. She was a stunning woman. I just moved to New York shortly before that awful accident and the funeral. I remember seeing her downtown outside the Film Forum, and she really was. The clothes were fabulous. She was just elegant, understated. The pictures didn't do her justice, really. But anyway, the picture for this particular Ryan Murphy
does not do her justice.
Certainly doesn't do her. But one of the big complaints, the clothes looked like Zara. I mean, now, no diss to Zara, no diss, but they are not these minimalist chic like Yohji Yamamoto, Prada, all the beautiful designers she wore Like, this looks like something, they're shocking. But apparently, worse than the clothes, it's the hair. Carolyn Kennedy had this hairstylist called Greg Johns. She eventually took out a letter, a cease and desist letter saying, would you stop talking about my bloody hair to everyone? And she stopped going to him. But he had done this thing which was called the chunking. And he gave her all this it was called beach butter hair, whatever.
God, you're losing me now, Marion.
Okay, Matt, I can tell
anyway.
you're riveted. Now, you know what? We'll put in a call for you if you get you some beach butter hair there. But anyway, he goes, oh my God, she would never have had her hair like this. It's flat. It looks like box colour. Nothing worse than looking like box colour, apparently. It's so 2024. And this actress in this shoot does not look anything like what you would imagine this stylist. She looks like a very ordinary girl who might work in an office. That was not Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. So there's outrage about this, about the fact that her clothes look cheap, her hair is all the same colour, and people are going berserk. But it shows to me more than anything the grip that the Kennedy myth still has on America.
Does it?
Because they're still fascinated by them.
But what are they fascinated about? I mean, actually,
the glamour, the tragedy, the mystery, the wealth.
Funny enough, because I had Maureen Callaghan on last year when she wrote that book about the
Kennedy women,
which is shocking. And the chapter about Carolyn Bessette is fascinating because that outlines in a lot of detail again about, the Kennedy kids. My God, what a bunch. They really are the Nepo babies, aren't they?
Oh, they are.
They really are. With
a couple of exceptions.
But John F. Kennedy's 2 kids, wasn't it? And Robert Kennedy had 11, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And of that 11, my God, the amount of misdemeanors and things that have actually happened amongst that bunch.
And real tragedies. 2 of them killed, 1 in overdose, 1 in a skiing accident, children dying of drug overdose. Awful stuff. And then you get RFK Jr. with his brainworm and his sawn off whale's head and his eating dogs and his bears in the park.
Which makes him a perfect health secretary for the Trump administration.
He was made for that administration.
But John F. Kennedy Jr., his just carelessness and recklessness effectively killed not just himself, but killed his wife and his sister-in-law. Because he shouldn't have been flying that plane at night and he didn't have the experience. And
do you know the fascinating thing about that and the chilling thing about that is that it was evident that an unlawful death case was going to come from the Bessette family. They lost both their daughters. Now, the Bessette family came from Greenwich, Connecticut, but they weren't wealthy Greenwich, Connecticut, as in the haves and the have-yachts Greenwich, Connecticut. Their mother was divorced and she was a school teacher. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy went to school, went to work, worked on the shop floor of a Calvin Klein in Boston. She was spotted there because she was tall and stunning. They brought her to New York and then she became Klein's executive assistant. Really smart woman. She was the one who said Kate Moss. At that stage, Calvin Klein had his 80s boom. He was heading towards bankruptcy. They had to rebrand. And so they rebranded with this sort of skinny, edgy, kind of lean. And she was a big force in all that. She was a very, very talented woman. Anyway.
More talented than the man she married.
Yeah, and the George magazine, which was a good idea but was failing fast. Anyway, they knew that there was an unlawful death suit coming from the Bessettes. And so this story came out that the reason John F. Kennedy Jr. had flown the plane late was all her fault because she was in New York and she was getting her toenails painted and they were the wrong colour lavender, so she made them take it off and do it all again. And but for the fact that she was so vain and neurotic, they would have taken off in time and they would have landed. So this was all an attempt to discredit her. And then when the lawful death suit arrived, the Kennedy lawyers were trying to say, no, it was her fault. We should be suing you. So basically then they ended up, it was so scurrilous and so unfair and so ludicrous because nobody made that guy, John F. Kennedy Jr., who apparently was a very nice guy by all accounts, nobody made him fly without the training in the dark. That was his decision.
In the dark. And he wasn't supposed to fly away from land. He was supposed to be visible to land at all stages.
That's right.
Because he lost the horizon. He couldn't see. And the rumour was that the belief is that the plane flew into the water upside down. He didn't know where he was.
Yeah, he had completely lost. There's all this spatial awareness stuff and all that he just... Anyway, they ended up having to pay $15 million to the Bessette family. But the way that her name was muddied and there was something very deliberate about that. Now, their marriage
the Ryan Murphy
trouble.
thing going to that because...
Oh, yeah.
Ryan Murphy's... There's a couple of the brilliant series. The O.J. Simpson series, The Trial of O.J. Simpson, was terrific television.
Yeah.
And also the one on the killing of...
Menendez brothers, he did?
No, I didn't actually.
The Gianni Versace.
The Versace one. Yeah. great
was
television
compelling.
as well. The compelling.
Murphy loves the murky stuff. So, yeah, he's going to go in. And
Now, whether it's historically accurate is another thing, but then it's a drama.
It's a drama.
It's not a documentary.
But one of the things that he is doing, I saw on the list of stars, like the top line crew, is the ex-boyfriend of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. There were claims that she was seeing him before she died. The fact that he's getting significant billing suggests that that's going to be worked in as well. So, Ryan Murphy, he loves the murky. He loves the murky. He loves the seamy underbelly. I suspect it'll be very entertaining, but they better get the hair right, because otherwise no one's going to pay attention.
I think that's where we leave it. Look, it's been great fun having you here.
Absolutely.
So, Marion McKeone, thank you for being with me. And thank
Pleasure.
you to Aidan and Thomas for looking after the production. And I very much hope we will be talking to you again. Goodbye.